Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Well, since you're so smart, go ahead and translate. The director laughed at the difficult to intimidate clinging lady. But when the German representative suddenly pointed to her, everyone was stunned. Hello, dear friends. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching us from. Don't forget to share your impressions, give us a like, and check if you're subscribed to our channel. Enjoy the show. The February morning hit the city with a blizzard. Barbara Novak trudged through snowdrifts, pulling her worn coat tighter. The wind flung sharp snowflakes into her face, making her squint and keep her head down. The bus had broken down halfway, and now she had to walk, risking being late. Just hope Tamara Rodriguez doesn't notice, Barbara thought, picking up her pace. The head janitor treated her with motherly care, but rules were rules, and lateness was still lateness. Around the corner loomed the gray buildings of Amanecer Electronica. Once a national industry leader, now the factory resembled an old warrior who had lost his strength but still held on with dignity, peeling walls, a faded sign, cracked tiles at the entrance, all signs of hard times. But the chimneys were smoking, which meant the factory's heart was still beating. Barbara slowed her step involuntarily. 10 years ago, as a fourth-year student at the Institute of Foreign Languages, specializing in German and legal translation, she couldn't have imagined ending up here. She saw again the sunny university corridor, the professor praising her difficult contract translation. Barbara Novak, you have an exceptional feel for legal terminology. I'm sure a great future awaits you after graduation. But that evening, a phone call shattered everything. Barbarita, Mom fell. She can't get up. The ambulance is on its way. First it was rheumatoid arthritis. Then year 2, year 3, the disease progressed, draining money, time, and energy. She couldn't stay in the full-time program. It's okay, she told herself. I'll take a break, work a bit, then return. But as time passed, going back got harder and harder. A sleek car sped by, splashing her with slush. Probably Camillo himself, she thought, recognizing the director's car. Driving in this weather without a care. At the gate stood Simeon Vasquez as always, a lean, upright old man with a military bearing. Once the chief technologist, now just a guard, but with all his dignity intact. Here comes our Barbara Novak, he greeted warmly when he saw her. Hurry, hurry. Today's a special day. What's happening, Don Simeon? Barbara stopped, brushing snow from her coat. The old man lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The Germans are coming. A delegation from Dusseldorf itself. I saw Vitalio Camillo yesterday, strutting with his briefcase. Had all the deputies lined up. They say they're signing a contract. Maybe the factory will finally get new equipment. Barbara asked hopefully. Simeon Vasquez snorted skeptically. Ah, daughter. In the old days, we made electronics so good the Germans came to learn from us. I was part of a delegation myself, presenting our innovations. And now. He waved a hand and didn't finish. Go on, don't be late. Tamara's already asking about you. The janitor's room was warm and smelled of bleach. Tamara Rodriguez, a heavy-set woman with henna-dyed hair, was organizing supplies onto carts. There you are, she grumbled without malice. I thought you got stuck in a snowdrift. The bus broke down, Dona Tamara, Barbara replied sheepishly, taking off her coat. I know, Tamara waved it off. You're a responsible girl, you wouldn't be late without a reason. Get changed quick. We're scrubbing the whole admin wing today. The Germans are coming, and Camillo's got everyone in a frenzy. Can you believe it? He even came down to the shop floor yesterday to inspect. Galia Fernandez says that hasn't happened since the governor's visit 5 years ago. As Barbara pulled on her work smock, she glanced in the cracked mirror, light brown hair tied in a neat bun, brown eyes, tired but still lively. 32 and I look 40, she thought bitterly. And to think, back in college, the boys couldn't stop staring at me during lectures. Barbie, are you listening? Tamara broke into her thoughts. Your section is the third floor. Start with the conference room. They had a meeting there late last night. The ashtrays are probably overflowing. Pushing her cart of supplies, Barbara climbed the stairs of the admin building. It was warmer, cleaner, more presentable than the rest of the factory. On the walls, faded awards from the past mixed with modern certificates in shiny frames. On the third floor, voices came from the director's slightly open office, one, a recognizable deep bass, Camillo's, the other. German, with that distinct, guttural articulation. Barbara slowed instinctively. They were talking about production capacities, it seemed. Her professional brain kicked in automatically. What are you standing around for? Get to work, barked Alejandra Arsenia, the director's secretary. A thin blonde with lips painted a garish pink, she looked at Barbara with open disdain. Sorry, Barbara began. Eavesdropping, the secretary interrupted. Great time for curiosity. The director's office doesn't need cleaning, he's in there. Go to the conference room, it's a mess from last night. The conference room was spacious, with a long polished table and chairs, once luxurious, now worn at the arms. Barbara got to work, collected cups, wiped surfaces, emptied ashtrays. Papers were scattered across the table, charts, floor plans, documents. As she stacked them, a sheet in German caught her eye, neatly typed, with the logo of Schultz Electronic GmbH. Professional instinct awoke instantly. She began to read, surprised at how easily her forgotten knowledge returned. It was a share acquisition agreement. Legal phrasing she had once drilled for exams came back as if it had never left. Barbara turned the page, absorbed. What's this little performance? Boomed Vitalio Camillo's voice, making her jump. The director stood in the doorway, a large man with thinning hair, wearing an expensive suit that looked too tight on his heavy frame. Behind him stood Borge Andres, shorter, trim, with a focused gaze. I was just cleaning and... Barbara stammered, setting the papers down. And decided to read confidential documents? Camillo stepped into the room, his face dark red. Do you realize that's a criminal offense? Senor Camillo, I only glanced accidentally. Accidentally? The director laughed. And do you even understand what's written there, Barbara? What's your last name? Novak, she said quietly. Barbara Novak. Camillo mimicked. Do you even know that's German? A flush spread across Barbara's cheeks. Humiliation burned worse than fear for her job. She answered clearly, her pronunciation flawless. I studied German at the Institute of Foreign Languages, specialized in legal translation. Camillo's eyebrows shot up, clearly not the response he expected. Is that so? He drawled. And how much did our mop-wielding translator manage to read? Borge Andres, silent until now, stepped forward. Don Vitalio, perhaps. Silence, snapped the director, then turned back to Barbara. Well, since you're so smart, translate this contract for us. Let's have a laugh. He threw the stack of papers on the table. I expect the translation by tomorrow morning. Let's see your talents, he added mockingly as he turned to leave. Come, Borge. We still have the presentation layout to discuss. Barbara stood gripping the mop handle tightly. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with determination. At that moment, she felt Borge Andres' gaze on her, curious, assessing, maybe even sympathetic. You can take the documents with you, he said quietly, pausing at the door. You won't be able to translate without them. When they left, Barbara slowly sank into a chair, unable to believe what had just happened. Then, with determination, she gathered the scattered contract papers into a neat stack. I'll prove to him I can do it. I'll prove it to all of them. She walked out of the conference room with the documents in her hands, feeling a long-forgotten fire reignite inside her, the thrill of a challenge, the desire to prove her worth. She was not just a cleaning lady, not just a shadow with a mop, she was Barbara Novak, a person who could still surprise the factory, and herself. The janitor's storage room was quiet, The day shift had long gone, and only the low hum of an old heater buzzed from the corner. Barbara sat on a worn-out chair, bent over the German text. The yellow light from a single lamp illuminated her focused face, fingers cracked from cleaning agents carefully turned the pages, and neat lines of translation multiplied in a battered notebook. The door creaked. "Why are you still here?" Tamara Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, wrapping her faded robe tighter around her. "It's already past 8. Everyone's gone." Barbara flinched, instinctively covering the documents. "Just finishing some work." Tamara stepped closer, peeking over her shoulder with curiosity. "Still digging through papers? What work are you doing at night?" Did the mop start speaking German? She smirked, without malice. "Go home. Your mom's probably waiting." Donna Nina's sitting there alone, worried. At the mention of her mother, Barbara quickly gathered the documents. "You're right, I lost track of time." "Lost track, huh?" Tamara mimicked. "Still clinging to your college dreams, aren't you?" There was no judgment in her voice, only a peculiar kind of respect, evident in how she motherly adjusted Barbara's collar and brushed an invisible speck from her shoulder. "Run along, silly girl. Don't miss the last bus." The old elevator doors screeched open. 5th floor, the familiar Khrushchevka building, with chipped paint on the walls. Barbara inserted the key into the lock and turned it gently, not to wake her mother. The apartment greeted her with warmth and the scent of chamomile tea. As she slipped off her shoes in the tiny hallway, she noted the usual neatness, an old mirror in a wooden frame, a shelf beneath it with a little vase always holding a seasonal bouquet. Now it held modest yellow dry flowers, carefully collected by Nina Garcia back in autumn. "Mom, I'm home," Barbara called softly as she entered the room. Nina Garcia sat by the window in her wheelchair, a straight back, neatly combed graying hair, a book on her lap, and little smile lines at the corners of her eyes as she smiled at her daughter. "You're late tonight." "I was about to call," she said in the soft, steady voice of a teacher who spent 30 years at the blackboard, a voice that could still make rowdy kids fall silent. "Lots of work today." Barbara kissed her mother on the cheek, which smelled of chamomile soap. She went into the tiny kitchen, full of echoes of the past, a Madonna dish set behind glass, once the family's pride, and a reproduction of a Levitan painting in a simple frame on the wall. "Want dinner?" Barbara peeked into a pot. "I'll heat something up." "I already ate," Nina Garcia replied, wheeling into the kitchen. The soft squeak of rubber wheels on linoleum had long become a familiar sound in their life. "Tell me what's new at the factory." Barbara hesitated while ladling soup into bowls. Should she talk about the contract, the clash with the director, the fact that she'd returned to translation? "Nothing special. They say investors from Germany are coming." Nina Garcia looked at her daughter carefully. "Your eyes are shining. That only happens when something important has happened." Barbara smiled despite herself. Nothing could be hidden from her mother, who knew every detail of her face too well. "Remember how I studied German?" she asked suddenly. "Well, it came in handy today. I stumbled on a document and—" "You translated it?" Nina's eyes lit up. "You know, I ran into your old classmate the other day. She's working at a law firm now, doing translations. She told me about their new office and all the clients they have. With your talent, you could be there too, sweetheart." Barbara gently shook her head. "Mom, don't start. Things turned out the way they had to." Her voice was calm, but the hand holding the spoon trembled slightly. They'd had this conversation many times before. Nina Garcia, always gently persistent, had told her again and again that it was a crime for someone with her mind to be holding a mop. And Barbara had calmly replied each time that times were hard, and a janitor with a salary was better than a translator with a diploma and no job. "I'm not starting." Nina sighed. "It's just a shame, that's all. Tell me instead what happened with you today." The conversation shifted to familiar ground. The neighbor from downstairs had shared seedlings, there was a nice concert on TV, and the library had finally brought a long-awaited novel. Simple joys that now defined the life of the former teacher. The quiet of the night was broken only by the ticking of an old clock and Nina's steady breathing behind the wall. Barbara sat at the kitchen table, documents spread out before her. A desk lamp, shielded by newspaper, cast just enough light to work without waking her mother. Her fingers danced over the paper, writing the translation, legal terms she once hated now forming a clear structure. Clause by clause, paragraph by paragraph, she dove deeper, her long-lost skill coming back to life. And then her pencil froze mid-sentence. Section 12, Clause 3, Subsection B, an unremarkable-looking paragraph buried among standard phrases but packed with dynamite. In the event of intentional distortion of financial reporting, the investor may initiate a change in management. The temporary manager shall be a person fluent in German and possessing professional knowledge of legal terminology. Barbara read the passage 3 times. Confusion gave way to understanding, and then concern. If Vitalio Camello really had been sugarcoating the financial reports, as the breakroom whispers suggested, and the Germans discovered it, the consequences for the factory could be catastrophic. She leaned back in her chair. The clock showed 3 a.m., but sleep wouldn't come. Faces floated before her eyes. Tamara Rodriguez, who couldn't imagine life without the factory even at 60, Simeon Vasquez, for whom the security post had become a second home, the young guys from the shop floors, just starting out in life. And Barbara made a decision. The accounting office greeted her in the morning with the smell of fresh coffee and old paper. Galia Fernandez, a graying woman in a tailored suit and glasses on a chain, sat at her desk clicking away at a calculator. Barbara, she looked up in surprise. Is something wrong? Barbara closed the door behind her and stepped closer, taking a deep breath, like someone diving into cold water. Dona Galia, I need your advice. The chief accountant stared at the cleaning woman holding a folder of documents. What kind of advice? I'm buried in quarterly reports, and now. Please. Barbara placed the translation on the desk with determination. This is very important for all of us. Something in her tone made Galia Fernandez set aside the calculator. She leafed through the pages, the frown between her brows deepening. Where did you get this? Senor Camello gave it to me, as a kind of test. An unspoken tension hung in the air. Galia Fernandez removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, tiredly. And why did you come to me? Because I'm worried about the factory, Barbara replied simply. If the contract is signed and then discrepancies in the financial reports come to light, the consequences will be severe, for the workers, the engineers, for me? Galia Fernandez finished the sentence. She fell silent, as if weighing something, then slowly closed the office door and returned to her desk. I've been at this factory for 30 years, she said in a low voice. Started back in the old days, when every penny had to be accounted for, and false reporting could land you in court. Back then, accounting was about honesty, she added with a bitter smile. Then the 90s hit, we survived however we could. Vitalio Camello, I'll give him credit, saved the factory. Sure, his methods were flexible. Everyone was doing it then, fudging the numbers a little to get a loan, to keep the tax office off our backs. The older woman sighed heavily. Then the times changed, but the habits stayed. And now, he wants the numbers doctored again, to impress the Germans. But I've got grandkids, and 2 years till retirement. Where would I go if something happens? Barbara said nothing, understanding the deep inner conflict the woman was grappling with. What are you planning to do? Galia Fernandez finally asked. I'll try talking to the director, to explain the risks. Maybe he'll listen? A sad smile touched the chief accountant's lips. Oh, girl, you really don't know him. She was about to say more when the door swung open. Borge Andre stood in the doorway. Sorry, Dona Galia. I didn't realize you had company. His eyes briefly flicked to Barbara. I'm waiting on the financial report for Section 3. I'll bring it right away, Galia said quickly, gathering the translated papers and getting up. Once she'd left the room, Borge didn't leave immediately. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, studying Barbara with renewed interest. "What business does a janitor have with the chief accountant?" Barbara straightened and met his gaze. "I wanted to consult her about the contract." "And what did you find?" "A clause about possible changes in management if financial violations are discovered." Borge raised his eyebrows. "You really understand legal documentation?" "For years of specialized translation studies," Barbara replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Borge was silent for a moment, as if deciding something. "You know," he finally said, lowering his voice, "this is a good factory, but sometimes leadership makes the wrong choices. I've been here a long time, and I care what happens to this place, and to the people in it." He stopped, hearing the footsteps of Galia Fernandez returning. "Be careful," he added quickly. As Barbara left the accounting office, she felt her resolve harden. She had to try and warn the director. Yes, he was a tyrant and a despot, but even he had to see that more than just his position was at stake. The future of the entire factory was on the line, hundreds of people who saw Amanecer Electronica not just as a job, but a part of their lives. She walked down the echoing corridor, each step ringing against the walls like an echo of her decision. She had to summon her courage and speak to Vitalio Camillo. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change things. The kitchen was flooded with gray February light. Barbara stirred her cooling tea, staring absently out the window at the frost-covered poplars. Her thoughts swirled around the upcoming conversation with the director. What words could she use? How to explain without wounding his pride? Nina Garcia, wheeling herself into the room, stopped opposite her daughter. Her wrinkled hand gently covered Barbara's. "What's troubling you, sweetheart? You've been out of sorts all morning." Barbara looked up. A shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the gray in her mother's hair, the fine web of wrinkles around her eyes, but her gaze was still sharp, still wise. A teacher's gaze. "Mom, what did you do when you saw your students heading down the wrong path?" The question came out before Barbara even realized she'd said it. Nina Garcia rubbed her temple thoughtfully. "You know, in 30 years of teaching, I saw a lot. But I always followed one rule. I warned them of the consequences, but the choice had to be theirs," she sighed softly. "Taking responsibility for your actions is one of life's most important lessons, sometimes the most important." Barbara nodded, feeling her resolve solidify inside. "And if someone refuses to listen?" "Then," Nina Garcia shrugged, "you have to wait for life to teach them, and be there to support them when it does." Barbara kissed her mother on the cheek. "Thank you, Mom. You're always right." The factory's administration building buzzed like a disturbed hive. The arrival of the German investors had thrown everything into chaos. Stressed employees rushed about, even the janitors had been issued new uniforms. Barbara stopped at the door to the director's reception area. Behind the desk sat Alejandra Arsenia, the terror of couriers and nightmare of visitors. Her flawlessly styled blonde hair and perfect makeup stood in stark contrast to the tense atmosphere around her. "I need to speak with Don Vitalio," Barbara said as she approached the secretary's desk. "It's important." Alejandra Arsenia looked up from her computer, her gaze skimmed over Barbara's plain dress and hands, clean but rough from work. "You? With the director?" A condescending smile curled on her painted lips. "Don't forget to bring your broom." Barbara felt the flush rise to her cheeks but replied calmly. "It's about the German contract. Senor Camillo himself assigned me the translation." The secretary's smile faded. "Wait here," she snapped and disappeared behind the director's office door. Barbara stood waiting in the reception area, aware of the eyes on her. Department heads, waiting their turn, glanced at her in confusion. What was a janitor doing here? The wait dragged on painfully. Barbara watched the foreman and department heads go into the office with bravado and squared shoulders, only to emerge hunched, defeated. One man in particular looked crushed as he exited, the chief engineer, an elderly man with thinning gray hair. His face was drawn and tired, his eyes full of helplessness. We're not going to finish preparing section 1 in time, he murmured to a colleague, not noticing Barbara nearby. The deadlines are impossible. And he doesn't care. Wants everything shining for the Germans. But where do we get the manpower? Where do we find spare parts? Alejandra Arsenia cut their conversation short, opening the door. Barbara Novak, the director will see you now. You have 5 minutes. Barbara squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The office was vast, with a high ceiling and polished parquet floor. A massive dark wood desk stood in the center, behind which a large leather chair loomed like a throne. On the walls hung certificates, awards in gilded frames, and photos of the director shaking hands with regional officials. A huge window offered a panoramic view of the factory grounds, like a visual reminder of who ruled this domain. Vitalio Camello didn't look up from his papers when she entered. Only after the door clicked shut did he lean back and give her a long, appraising glance. So, what did our mop-wielding translator find? He said with barely concealed mockery. Barbara placed the folder with the translation on his desk. I translated the contract, as you asked. So what? He said, taking the papers with theatrical reluctance. Decided to show off your talents? I found a clause that could pose a risk to the company, Barbara said steadily, doing her best to keep her voice from trembling. In Section 12, there's a provision about potential management replacement if financial misconduct is discovered. If the reports contain discrepancies, and the contract gets signed. Vitalio Camello, who had been listening with a smirk, suddenly leaned forward. What? He quickly flipped through the translated pages to the indicated section. Where did you? He cut himself off, and his face flushed deep red. I simply translated the text, Barbara replied calmly, and I believe it's my duty to warn you that if the German side finds any discrepancies. Duty? The director slammed his fist on the desk. Who do you think you are, telling me what to do? I've kept this plant afloat for 15 years. Back in the 90s when factories like this were collapsing all over the country, I kept this one running. And now you think you can lecture me on how to handle documents? His voice filled the office. It seemed even the glass in the framed photos shook. Senor Camello, I came with good intentions, Barbara said, struggling to maintain her composure. If the German investors put in their money and later find manipulated figures, the whole plant will suffer, all the employees. It's not your place to teach me anything, the director stood, towering over the desk. Who are you? A janitor. Eavesdropping on private conversations, sticking your nose into documents that don't concern you. Barbara felt something crack inside, not fear, but the bitterness of injustice. The man holding the fate of hundreds in his hands wouldn't even hear a warning. I only wanted to help, she said quietly. Help? Camillo gave a short laugh. Do you know how many helpful people like you I've seen? Always jealous, always trying to undermine, then claiming to care about the collective. He marched to the door and flung it open. If I catch you poking into documents again, you're fired. Now get back to your mop. Barbara stepped out, aware of the curious stares around her. Her cheeks were burning, and her eyes welled with tears, not from offense, but from helplessness. She hurried down the corridor, eager to escape those looks. Barbara Novak, a familiar voice called. Borge Andre stood by his office. His perceptive gaze immediately read her expression like an open book. Please come in, he said, stepping aside to let her through. The deputy director's office was starkly different from the director's grand suite, a modest space with a desk cluttered with blueprints, diagrams on the walls, production cycle graphs, nothing but the essentials. Sit, Borge said, pouring her a glass of water. Drink. Barbara gratefully took a sip. Borge watched her closely, without the slightest hint of condescension. You went to Don Vitalio about that clause in the contract? Barbara nodded. I wanted to warn him. If the Germans find out about the report manipulation. They will, Borge said calmly. They've been in the business for years. They have their own auditors, their own methods. Then why won't the director fix anything? Borge sighed heavily and sat across from her. Not everyone in management agrees with Camello's methods. But many stay silent, some out of fear, some thinking it's for the greater good. He gave a lopsided smile. He really did save this plant in the 90s, when other directors were looting theirs. But times have changed. Now he thinks he has the right to do whatever he pleases. There was no anger in his voice, only the weariness of someone who'd watched things go wrong for a long time but hadn't been able to change them. What happens now? Barbara asked softly. I don't know, Borge admitted. But you'd better keep your distance from this. Camello's not the kind to forgive. The evening bus swayed gently as it carried Barbara home. Outside, familiar streets passed by, gray apartment blocks, the occasional window lit up, bare trees dusted with snow. At home, Nina Garcia immediately sensed something was wrong. Did you talk to the director? Barbara just nodded and sat down. And? Nina turned on the electric kettle, an old one with a cracked plastic handle. He wouldn't listen. Threw me out. Told me not to meddle. Her mother tipped down a box of tea from the shelf. You know, when I worked at school, our principal checked every morning to see if the classrooms were warm, if there was enough chalk, if the desks were in good shape. And he never doctored the reports. Said honesty was worth more than perfect numbers. She poured the tea into cups. People who come to warn of danger should be thanked, not thrown out. But not everyone understands that. They sat in the kitchen for a long time. The tea cooled, streetlights flickered on outside, and Barbara told her mother everything, about the factory, about Borge Andres, about the German contract. Nina listened without interrupting, only nodding now and then in understanding. Night brought anxiety. Barbara tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. Her thoughts tangled, Vitalio Camello's sneering face, Borge's weary eyes, her mother's wrinkled hands sorting her medicine, so many pills for such a small pension. What if Camello, angered by her interference, started looking for someone to blame? What if her silence led the Germans to uncover the fraud and cancel the contract? What would happen to the factory then? To all those people? As if in answer to her thoughts, her mother's words resurfaced. I warned them about the consequences, but the decision was always theirs. Barbara sat up in bed. The decision came to her suddenly but with complete clarity. She had warned Camello, fulfilled her duty. But if he wouldn't listen, someone else had to. She stood, feeling for her slippers. In the desk drawer, she found the business card she had spotted earlier among the documents. Germano Steiner, Schultz Electronic GmbH. She pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write, in German. It was risky, maybe even reckless, but if the fate of the factory was at stake, of the hundreds of people whose lives depended on it, she couldn't remain silent. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. The city library, an old building with columns and cracked plaster, greeted Barbara with its familiar quiet and the scent of book dust. The computer room, a cramped nook with 3 outdated machines, was empty. Few people spent their weekends here. Barbara took the seat farthest from the librarian's watchful eye. The screen flickered, the system loaded painfully slowly. She pulled a notebook from her bag with the draft she'd written at night, along with photos of key contract pages she had secretly taken on the janitor's work camera. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. Was she doing the right thing? Was this betrayal? No, she told herself firmly. Betrayal is staying silent when you see danger for hundreds of people. She began to type, carefully choosing her German words and legal phrasing. She explained her position at the factory, mentioned her education, without boasting. She described the clause she'd found and her concerns about the financial reports. Avoiding direct accusations, she hinted at possible discrepancies. My goal is not to create problems for management, but to protect the company from a potential crisis, she wrote, her heart pounding. I believe that an objective review before the contract is signed would benefit both parties. She spent 3 hours polishing every sentence, checking the grammar, rereading everything again and again. Finally, attaching the photos and her translation of the key section, Barbara took a deep breath and hit send. The email went out, and with it, the feeling that she had just crossed an invisible but crucial line. The following week stretched into an eternity. Barbara worked as usual, mopping floors, dusting shelves, emptying trash, but inside, she was consumed by anxious anticipation. Every glance from management felt suspicious, every call from Tamara Rodriguez seemed like a prelude to exposure. Meanwhile, the factory was transforming before her eyes, walls in the workshops were being hastily repainted, broken windows replaced, and years' worth of junk finally cleared out. Workers on the night shift were repairing equipment that had sat idle for months due to a lack of spare parts, but now, somehow, everything necessary had been found. A feverish energy of impending change filled the air. They even ordered us to scrub the toilets until they shine. Tamara Rodriguez exhaled as she pulled out a fresh canister of cleaning fluid. Never seen the bosses care about the bathrooms before. Those Germans must really be big shots. On Wednesday, a general assembly was announced. The auditorium, with its creaky chairs and faded curtains, couldn't hold everyone. People lined the walls and packed the aisles. The air buzzed with whispers and speculation. Vitalio Camello stepped onto the stage with a confident stride, his new suit fit impeccably, and a pen reading "Honored Industrial Worker" gleamed on his lapel. "Comrades, colleagues," he began, sweeping the room with an authoritative gaze. "Tomorrow marks a new era for our enterprise. A delegation from Schultz Electronic is arriving to sign a strategic contract that will save our factory." He spoke of a new stage of development, production modernization, and a return to the international market. His words were loud and confident, but Barbara, standing by the back wall, noticed the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. She also saw Borge Andres nearby, focused, sleep-deprived, his gaze restless. "I personally guarantee," Camello raised his voice, "that this deal will benefit every single worker at Amanecer. From me too." He made a sweeping gesture toward Barbara, not recognizing her in the crowd. "The cleaning lady." The hall erupted in applause, people smiled and exchanged hopeful glances. Barbara stood still, her heart heavy. What if she was wrong? What if her interference only caused harm? The reply from Germano Steiner came on the 10th day. Barbara found it while checking her email at an internet cafe near her home. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the German address in her inbox. "Dear Senorita Novak," Steiner wrote, "thank you for the information. Your observations confirm some of our concerns. The company is sending a special commission for a more thorough inspection. Please be prepared to cooperate, but remain discreet for now." The message ended with a mobile number for emergency contact. Barbara read every word 3 times. It had worked. She had been heard. Back home, she found her mother sorting through old photographs, yellowed pictures of students, colleagues, school events. "Found my students from the class of '85, Nina Garcia smiled. "Look." She studied her daughter closely. "Something happened? You look determined." Barbara sat beside her and gently took one of the photos. "I was just thinking. All these people were once just kids, guided by someone. And now, they're the ones making important decisions." Nina Garcia gently stroked her daughter's hand. "Every decision changes something, even the smallest ones." The German delegation arrived on Thursday morning as planned. 3 sleek, imposing black cars glided through the factory gates, drawing admiring murmurs from the workers gathered at the entrance. Barbara watched from a distance through the administrative building's window. She saw Vitalio Camello greet the guests, bowing slightly, shaking hands, smiling. She also spotted the tall silver-haired man in an impeccable gray suit, Germano Steiner, and noticed his gaze linger for a moment on the window behind which she stood. The factory tour began. The visitors moved in a tight group, trailed by the director and other management figures. As Barbara wiped windows in the hallway, she heard Camello praising the plant's production capacity and highly skilled workforce. The group was shown only the cleanest, most polished sections. Camello personally ensured the route stayed on script. But Germano Steiner, with his observant eyes and subtle smile, was not an easy guest. "And now, if you don't mind," he said suddenly, "we would like to see Workshop 3. If I remember the facility layout correctly, that's where the machines needing the most investment are located. Vitalio Camello froze for a moment. Workshop 3? But, dear Senor Steiner, it's currently undergoing scheduled maintenance. The conditions there are far from ideal. That's exactly why we want to see it, the German said firmly. We need to understand the real scale of investment required. In the conference room, where the official meeting was held, Steiner continued pressing. His questions about the company's financial state became sharper and more specific. These profitability indicators seem rather optimistic, he said, studying the documents Camello provided. Could you clarify your calculation methodology? Camello began to explain, but stumbled over his own words, sweat beaded on his forehead. Galia Fernandez, he turned to the chief accountant, please explain our accounting principles to Senor Steiner. And you, Arcadio Sanchez, he nodded to the company lawyer, clarify the legal framework. He was clearly passing the responsibility, but kept smiling, projecting confidence. Only the whitened knuckles gripping his pen betrayed his tension. The call came that same evening as Barbara was walking home. The number was unfamiliar, with an international code. Senorita Novak, came a composed voice with a distinct accent. Germano Steiner. Could we meet this evening, say in an hour, at the Old Town Cafe? Her heart leapt into her throat. She agreed, only asking for time to stop by home and inform her mother. Old Town Cafe, a small, cozy spot just steps from the central square, was nearly empty. Steiner was already waiting at a table in the back, a cup of black coffee in front of him. Up close, he looked older than he had from afar, deep lines across his forehead, crow's feet at the corners of his eyes, but his gaze radiated calm strength and perceptiveness. Thank you for coming, he said, standing up. Welcome, Barbara. I ordered you some tea, I hope that's all right. Barbara sat down, feeling her knees tremble. Until now, her contact with foreigners had been limited to classrooms and translation texts. Senor Steiner, Please, just Germano, he interrupted gently. And let's speak Spanish. My German is probably better than yours, but your Spanish is definitely better than mine. The small joke helped ease the tension a little. Barbara smiled and took a sip of hot tea. You know, Steiner said, looking her directly in the eyes, I've suspected manipulation in the financial reports for a while, too perfect numbers, overly smooth charts. But I had no concrete evidence. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. To be honest, we were unsure whether Amanecer was even worth investing in. Companies like this often turn out to be financial sinkholes. But because of your letter, I decided to come personally, to see if there were still people here who truly care. Barbara felt her face flush. I didn't mean to get anyone in trouble, truly. But the factory isn't just Vitalio Camello, it's hundreds of people who work there. It's a part of the city's history, her voice wavered. My mother says everyone must take responsibility for their actions. But is it fair that everyone should suffer for one man's decisions? Steiner thoughtfully turned his coffee cup in his hands. You know, in my youth, I worked as an engineer at a similar enterprise in East Germany. After reunification, many factories in the East were shut down due to poor management, corruption, and inability to compete. His gaze grew distant with memory. I remember the eyes of those workers, engineers, and technicians, not just losing jobs, but losing their purpose in life. He straightened up, once again composed and businesslike. We don't want to see that happen here. We need honest partners, not just for the contract, but for the people behind it. What happens now? Barbara asked, twirling a spoon between her fingers. Tomorrow, a full audit begins. We've brought our own specialists. It will be handled professionally and discreetly. They spoke for nearly another hour. Steiner asked about the factory, the workers, how Barbara had ended up there. Strangely, it was easier for her to talk to this German, whom she had only just met, about her hopes and disappointments than it was with most colleagues she saw every day. As they parted at the cafe entrance, Steiner said unexpectedly, "You remind me of my daughter, just as principled." He smiled slightly. "Take care of yourself," Barbara Novak. The next morning, the accounting department at the factory was unusually busy. 3 German auditors, each with a leather briefcase and laptop, methodically reviewed documentation. Vitalio Camillo tried to supervise the process, but Steiner politely yet firmly insisted on unrestricted access to all materials. Barbara was wiping down surfaces in the corridor when Galia Fernandez suddenly slipped out of the restroom. Her face was pale, hands trembling. "Just a minute," she whispered, pulling Barbara into the supply closet. Glancing at the door, the chief accountant pulled a folder from her bag. "This is a copy of the actual financial reports, no embellishments, no edits," she said, thrusting the folder into Barbara's hands. "I'm retiring soon anyway. Let my conscience be clean at least at the end of my career." Her tired, worn-out eyes brightened for a moment. "You know, I remember how we used to work back in the day. There were rough times, sure, but nothing like this." "What about Vitalio Camillo?" Barbara whispered. "What about him?" Galia gave a bitter smirk. "Maybe it's time he answered for his masterpieces? How many times can lightning strike the same spot?" She slipped out as quietly as she had come, leaving Barbara holding a folder that burned her hands like hot coal. That same day, Barbara handed the documents to Steiner. She didn't see how the audit proceeded, but the plant buzzed like a disturbed hive. Rumors swirled through the workshops, each one worse than the last. A day later, the audit results landed on the director's desk. Years of financial manipulation confirmed, grossly inflated figures, hidden debts, fictitious contracts, all of it surfaced. Vitalio Camillo stormed around his office like a cornered animal, his face dark with rage. "Who," he roared, flinging papers. "Who leaked this to the Germans? I won't let this go unpunished." Arcadio Sanchez, pale with fear, tried to calm his boss. "Don Vitalio, maybe there's still room to negotiate. After all, the deal is very important to them." But Camillo couldn't be stopped. He demanded the rat be found and promised to crush them. Tension across the factory mounted by the hour. People gathered in corners, whispered, and dispersed. The air reeked of change, frightening for some, long awaited for others. Barbara walked down the corridor, the folded slip of paper with Steiner's phone number crumpled in her pocket. Now that everything was out in the open, she felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety, as if a boulder had rolled off her chest. But the unknown lay ahead, and it breathed cold. As she passed Borge Andres' office, she heard his voice. "No, Vitalio Camillo, I won't do it. Enough lies. This factory deserves better leadership." She quickened her pace. What had begun as a small spark, her letter to the German investor, was now spreading like a blaze, ready to consume the entire factory. And that fire could destroy or purify. What happens next? Barbara thought, descending the staircase of the administrative building. The unknown was terrifying, but hope flickered in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something truly important, something that could change not only her fate but the lives of many others. And that was worth any risk. The boardroom resembled a battlefield after a shelling, financial reports scattered across the polished table, interspersed with diagrams and charts. The air was thick with tension, palpable, like the hush before a storm. Vitalio Camillo sat at the head of the table, hunched over the documents, as if the weight of the accusations physically pressed down on him. The face that radiated confidence only yesterday now looked hollow, with dark circles under the eyes. Germano Steiner stood by the window, composed and unshaken, a shaft of sunlight reflected off his silver hair, forming something like a halo. Beside him stood 2 auditors with stony expressions, like judges about to deliver a verdict. "Gentlemen," Steiner turned to the room, his voice steady, without triumph, but also without doubt. "The audit results leave no room for interpretation. Discrepancies in financial reporting, inflated production numbers, concealment of the equipment's real condition. All of this puts our agreement at serious risk." Camillo flushed. His fist slammed down on the table. "You don't understand our circumstances. The 90s were about survival. We did what we had to do to keep the factory alive. I fully understand the circumstances, Senor Camillo, Steiner replied calmly. But manipulation of financial records is unacceptable, then or now. We can revise the documentation, Arcadio Sanchez interjected, nervously adjusting his glasses. As the company's legal advisor, I guarantee everything will be aligned with the requirements. Too late, the senior auditor said firmly. Trust has been broken. Camillo looked around the room. I built this factory. I saved it from bankruptcy. 15 years of nonstop work. No one denies your contributions, Steiner said gently. But we cannot build a partnership on a foundation of deceit. At that moment, Borge Andres rose from his seat. His voice, usually reserved, now rang with unexpected firmness. I support our German partners. It's long overdue that we conduct business honestly. It's in the best interest of the factory and all its workers. Camillo stared at his deputy as if he transformed into a monster before his eyes. You. I trusted you. And you. Precisely because I believe in this factory, Borge replied calmly. In its people. In its future. Steiner gave Borge a grateful nod and addressed the room again. Despite all the violations uncovered, we remain interested in collaboration, he paused. But only under one condition, changes to the management structure. Arcadio Sanchez flinched. What exactly do you mean? We are activating the clause regarding potential leadership changes, Steiner said, looking directly at Camillo. Schultz Electronic is prepared to invest in Amanecer on the condition that the current general director be temporarily relieved of his duties. A stunned silence fell over the room, only Camillo's heavy breathing could be heard. His face turned white, then blotchy. What? He sneered. You can't. This is my factory, I brought it back from the brink. Who will you put in my place? One of your German managers who doesn't understand our system? Steiner shook his head. According to the contract, the interim leader must be someone who speaks German and has legal knowledge of the deal. He glanced around the room. There is such a person here at your enterprise. A murmur swept through the room. All eyes turned to the company lawyer Arcadio Sanchez, to the chief engineer. Some even glanced at Borge Andres, though it was well known he didn't speak German. Steiner stepped toward the door and opened it. Please invite Barbara Novak in. Barbara appeared in the doorway. She had changed into her best dress, simple, dark blue, but clean and neat. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her face bare of makeup. She stood upright, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Vitalio Camillo's sharp, nearly hysterical laugh. The cleaning lady? Are you out of your minds? This is a farce. Senorita Novak possesses the necessary skills and qualifications, Steiner continued calmly. She speaks fluent German and has nearly completed a degree in legal translation. But more importantly, he looked at Barbara with respect. She has shown herself to be someone who genuinely cares about this company, a person of principle and integrity. So it was her? Camillo sprang up, pointing a trembling finger at Barbara. She's the one who leaked the information to you? This. Senor Camillo, Steiner interrupted, his voice suddenly steely. I strongly advise you to contain your emotions. This is a business decision, not a personal vendetta. Borge Andres stepped toward Barbara, placing himself beside her as if shielding her from the storm about to break. Of course, Senorita Novak will not be managing the enterprise alone, Steiner continued. She will initially serve as a liaison consultant with our company, while Borge Andres, with his production expertise, will oversee daily operations. Together, they will form a temporary leadership team until the situation stabilizes. Vitalio Camillo was gasping with rage, his gaze darting between the German, Barbara, and Borge. You'll regret this, he finally spat. You think you can handle it, he sneered at Barbara. With your mop-wielding experience? In a month, you'll be begging for forgiveness. He strode toward the exit, but just before the door, he turned back. This isn't over. When the door slammed shut behind the former director, the room seemed to breathe again. Steiner approached Barbara and extended his hand. "Congratulations, Senorita Novak. Or perhaps I should say, Director Novak." Barbara shook his hand hesitantly, still not fully believing what had just happened. Her eyes turned to Borge, searching for reassurance. This is all very unexpected," was all she could manage. Steiner smiled knowingly. "I understand that you weren't prepared for this role, but sometimes life chooses us, not the other way around." As the room slowly emptied, only Barbara, Borge, and Steiner remained. They sat down at the table, now as partners, not as subordinate and superior. "We've got a lot to do," Borge said, laying out some papers. "We need to conduct a full inventory, assess the real state of assets, and reevaluate our staffing strategy." Steiner listened attentively, occasionally making notes. Barbara watched them both, feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement, as though she stood at the edge of a cliff but knew she could leap. "I don't expect miracles," Steiner said as their discussion wrapped up. "But I do believe in your honesty and professionalism. We'll give you time to restore order. What matters most now is rebuilding trust between our companies and within your team." He checked his watch. "I have to meet with our board in the Capitol, but I'll be in touch. People believe in you. Don't let them down." After he left, Barbara and Borge sat together in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. "I think from today on, we no longer have personal lives," Borge finally said, attempting a smile. "I can't do this," Barbara whispered, looking down at her hands, still bearing traces of cleaning agents. "How can I lead people who just yesterday watched me mop their floors?" Borge unexpectedly placed his hand over hers. "We'll do it together." His voice was more confident than he felt. "I know the production side, you know the language and the legal details. Together we can do what Camillo never could with his heavy-handed ways." Barbara looked at him gratefully. In his eyes, she saw not pity or condescension, but respect, and that gave her strength. "Then let's begin," she said quietly, but firmly. The factory buzzed like a disturbed hive. News of the leadership change spread like wildfire. Walking through the corridors, Barbara felt the eyes on her, surprised, skeptical, mocking. Some people stepped aside, others turned their backs. Tamara Rodriguez caught her just outside the administrative building. "Well, I'll be damned, Novak." She shook her head, but her eyes sparkled with pride. "Our girl, and look how high you've flown." "I haven't flown anywhere yet," Barbara smiled wearily. "No one knows how this will turn out." "It'll turn out fine," Tamara said confidently. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, you'll manage. And Don Borge's no fool either." She lowered her voice. "And Camillo, word is he's raising hell in the regional offices, storming from one department to another." Barbara nodded. She had never expected Camillo to go down quietly. She returned home late, exhausted but clear-headed. Nina Garcia was waiting in the kitchen, checking notebooks for the students she occasionally tutored. Something happened at the factory. She immediately noticed the particular look on her daughter's face. Barbara sat beside her and hugged her. "Mom, I'm not a janitor anymore." And she told her everything about the letter to the Germans, the audit, the director's dismissal, and her new role. She expected surprise, disbelief, even indignation. But Nina Garcia just nodded, as if recognizing something long known. "I always knew your knowledge wouldn't go to waste," she said once Barbara had finished. Her wrinkled hand rested gently on her daughter's shoulder. "But remember, the higher the position, the greater the responsibility." Those simple words suddenly gave Barbara the clarity she hadn't had before. Yes, she'd been given an extraordinary opportunity, almost like a fairy tale. But this wasn't a Cinderella story about finding a prince. It was about proving, to herself and others, that she was worthy of trust. "I'm scared, Mom," she admitted. "Fear can be a good guide, so long as there's not too much of it," Nina smiled. "It keeps you cautious, but it won't stop you from doing what you must." They stayed up late, talking about everything and nothing, as if saying goodbye to their old life and welcoming a new one, full of challenges and possibility. As she fell asleep, Barbara thought about how strange life was. Just a week ago, she was a janitor, a woman of unrealized dreams, a shadow with a mop. And now, a path had opened before her that she never even dared to imagine. Will I make it? The question pulsed through her mind, keeping her awake. But deep down, a quiet certainty was beginning to form. She would. Because she had the truth on her side. Because people believed in her. Because her mother had taught her that honesty is worth more than comfort. Outside, snow was falling, covering the city in a white blanket, as if nature itself was signaling, the time for change had come, the time to start anew. And Barbara Novak was ready to accept that challenge. The April sun filtered through the clean windows of the administrative building. The snow had long melted, revealing the factory grounds, a freshly painted fence, neatly etched curbs, benches by the main gate where workers smoked. Amanecer Electronica seemed to have shaken off years of weariness and stood tall once more. Barbara stood at the window of her office, watching the morning shift arrive. People walked with purpose now, no longer slouched as before. Over the past 3 months, she had learned to recognize everyone. There was Simeon from Workshop 3, father of 3, young Ignacio, a recent trade school graduate, and Antonia, a woman who had worked the assembly line for 40 years. Looks good, doesn't it? Borge Andres had quietly approached and stood beside her. When people feel stability, they walk and speak differently, Barbara replied. Their partnership had proven unexpectedly effective. She handled external communications, translations, and the legal nuances of working with the German partners. He managed production, technical matters, and vendor relations. Together, they were slowly transforming a dying factory into a company with a future. Steiner called, Barbara said, stepping away from the window. He's very pleased with the latest report. He says if we maintain this pace, we'll reach 20% production growth by a year's end. 20%. Borge echoed, shaking his head. 6 months ago, I would have called that a fantasy. He smiled, and Barbara caught herself thinking that his smile had become a comforting part of her day, like a warm cup of morning coffee. There was a knock at the door. Galia Fernandez entered with a folder and her glasses on a chain. Quarterly report, as requested, she said, placing the papers on the desk. The first in 15 years without a single embellishment, her voice carried the quiet pride of someone who had finally done their job honestly. The wrinkles around her eyes had softened, her movements were more confident, as if an unbearable weight had lifted from her shoulders. Now I can retire with a clear conscience, she added. 1 month left, and then a well-earned rest. Barbara knew how much it had cost this woman to admit to the manipulations and hand over the documents to the German auditors. For that, Vitalio Camello, though removed from his post, had branded her a traitor. But she hadn't broken. And now, she stood tall, as if a lifelong burden had finally vanished. By the way, I have a candidate to take my place, Galia added with a sly smile. Young, but sharp. Finishing her degree in auditing and analysis by correspondence. And with principals Cicero would envy. Bring her in, we'll see, Barbara agreed. The day was packed. After lunch, a meeting was held about the new small electronics line they hoped to launch by autumn. Company lawyer Arcadio Sanchez, as usual, listed all the risks, pointedly coughing into his starched handkerchief. In my experience, such projects are risky in our particular situation. Dealing with Arcadio was always the hardest. Closely tied to Vitalio Camello, not just professionally, but, as the smoking room whispers suggested, through some shady dealings in the past, he refused to accept the new reality. He resisted every step of the way, obstructed progress, and made barbed comments about interims and upstarts. Senor Sanchez, what exactly do you mean by particular situation? Barbara asked without looking up from her papers. Please clarify. He hesitated, caught off guard. I meant the market conditions, of course. Then please review the marketing report commissioned by our German partners, Barbara said, sliding a hefty folder toward him. It contains all market forecasts and risk analyses for the next 2 years. If you find anything we missed, let us know. Borge allowed himself a barely visible smile. Barbara had not fired Arcadio, though she had more than enough reason. Instead, day by day, she made him work by the new rules, transparently, clearly, and with justification for every decision. She didn't threaten, didn't pressure, she simply demanded the same professionalism from him that she expected from herself. Any other questions? Barbara asked, glancing around the room. No one answered. Even Arcadio buried himself in his papers. That evening, just as most employees were leaving, Barbara's secretary rushed into the office. Barbara Novak, trouble. Customs called, our shipment of components for the first German contract is delayed. Some problem with the paperwork. It was the first serious crisis for the new leadership. A production halt would mean not only financial loss, but damage to their hard-earned reputation being the most valuable asset they gained. Barbara assessed the situation instantly. Call Borge Andres, he's still in the workshops. And get customs on the line. The following hours blurred into a non-stop marathon: phone calls, paperwork, consultations with Hermann Steiner, negotiations with customs officers. Barbara and Borge worked late into the night, going through every possible scenario. No, this smells like sabotage, Borge said tiredly, reviewing another document. The paperwork was in order, I checked it myself. Someone created this problem deliberately. Camillo? Barbara rubbed her tired eyes. Most likely. He still has friends in the regional administration. Barbara thought for a moment, then suddenly perked up. Wait, you once mentioned an old friend at the Ministry of Industry? The one you went to school with? Yes, but we haven't spoken in 10 years. Call him. Now. I'll get in touch with Steiner. The Germans must have their own levers of influence. By morning, they had a solution. Thanks to Borge's call to his former classmate, now a ministry official, they confirmed the problem was artificial. Intervention from the German consulate, arranged by Steiner, cut the Gordian knot. The shipment was released, deliveries resumed. Ironically, the crisis had united the team. Barbara and Borge didn't leave the factory for 3 days, sleeping in turns on a couch in his office, living on sandwiches brought by employees. Everyone saw how the new leadership fought for them, for their jobs, for their future. Engineers offered temporary technical solutions, workers agreed to overtime. Even Arcadio Sanchez found a legal loophole to navigate the bureaucratic mess. As for Camillo, his fingerprints on the sabotage only further tarnished his reputation. The May morning was warm and sunny. Barbara entered the hospital room with a bouquet of lilies of the valley. Nina Garcia, thinner after her surgery but with rosier cheeks, sat by the window. Well? How was the round? Barbara kissed her mother's cheek. The doctor said, your old bones are healing up nicely. Nina smiled. 1 more month of rehab and I can try walking with a cane. Barbara squeezed her mother's hand. The expensive surgery in a specialized clinic, something they'd never dreamed of before, had become a reality. Barbara's new salary and the bonus for resolving the supply crisis had made it possible. Just don't rush it, Barbara said. Take all the time you need. I've paid for everything. Nina Garcia looked at her daughter with pride. You've changed so much, standing tall, your voice stronger. A real boss. Barbara blushed. What kind of boss am I? I'm just trying to work honestly and help people. That's what real leadership is, Nina said softly. And how's your Borge Andres doing? Barbara blushed. Mom, he's not mine. We're just working together. Of course, her mother nodded with a sly smile. That must be why he visits me every weekend, brings books, shares factory news. Indeed, something more than a professional relationship had begun to grow between Barbara and Borge. It started with fleeting glances during meetings, with the cup of coffee he brought her every morning, with his habit of offering his hand when she stepped down the icy stairs at the factory entrance. Subtle gestures, invisible to outsiders, but forming a space of trust and understanding between them. One evening, while they were staying late working on equipment modernization plans, he suddenly placed his hand over hers. "You know, Barbara," he said, addressing her warmly and simply for the first time. "I noticed you the very first day, when you were mopping the floor in Camello's office. You looked so out of place, like a rare book misplaced among technical manuals." Barbara blushed but didn't pull her hand away. Borge looked at her not with pity or condescension, but with genuine admiration. "Remember the day Camello caught you with those German documents?" he continued. "That's when I thought, here's a woman who's not afraid to be herself, even when it comes at a cost. There aren't many like that these days." In the middle of summer, Germano Steiner flew in from Dusseldorf with an important proposal. After 3 months of successful crisis management, the board of directors at Schultz Electronic recommended officially confirming the new leadership structure: Barbara Novak as executive director, Borge Andres as technical director. "We believe in your potential," Steiner said, shaking their hands. "The results speak for themselves." And the results truly were impressive: balanced financial reports, new orders, including export contracts, and equipment modernization. But most importantly, there was a new attitude among the workers. Salaries had been raised, and some old social programs were reinstated: support for veteran employees, summer camps for employees' children. "Amanecer has a future again," Borge said as they signed the new contracts. "And we've got real work worth doing." Vitalio Camello didn't stop trying to reclaim his seat. He organized inspections, tried to block shipments, spread rumors about temporary upstarts. But all his efforts broke against one solid wall: the earned respect of partners and honest business practices. Eventually, even his most loyal supporters began shifting toward the new leadership. The anniversary of their collaboration with the German investors was marked with a formal assembly. The auditorium was as full as in the best days, but the atmosphere was entirely different: not stiffly official, but genuinely celebratory. Barbara and Borge presented the company's progress. The numbers spoke for themselves. The company had not only survived, but was growing, expanding its product line, increasing staff. In the past month alone, 20 new employees had been hired. For the first time in years, Amanecer had vacancies. Germano Steiner, who had flown in specifically for the event, took the stage to applause. "Friends," he began, with his distinctive accent. "A year ago, when we were just starting, many doubted us. In Germany, they told me, it's impossible. These factories are too stuck in old ways to change." He looked around the room. "But I believe that the key lies not in the country, but in the people, and you proved me right. Your collaboration is a shining example of how honesty, professionalism, and respect for tradition can create a modern and successful enterprise." That evening, Barbara walked down the same corridors she had walked a year earlier. Back then, she had been cleaning those windows, mopping those floors, trying not to be noticed. Now she was greeted with smiles, respectful nods, kind words. She stopped at a large window overlooking the factory yard, where workers were installing a new bench beneath the old tree, at the request of the factory's retirees. How many lives had this gray concrete walled compound held? How many stories the main gate could tell, built by the entire plant 30 years ago? A deep feeling of connection with this place and its people swept over Barbara. This was her factory, not in the possessive way Camello had spoken, but in the sense of shared purpose, collective effort, and a common destiny. She went down to the old storage room where she used to change for her shifts. Tamara Rodriguez, still just as loud and full of energy, was making tea for the cleaning staff. "Look who's come to visit us, our director herself." Tamara clapped her hands. "Girls, look who it is." Barbara hugged the senior cleaner. "How are you all? Everything all right?" "Better than ever." Tamara beamed. "We got new uniforms, the break room was renovated, they even put in a microwave." She nodded proudly toward the shiny new appliance in the corner. "And I always said, our Barbara doesn't read all those smart books for nothing. She'll go far." That evening, Barbara and Borge came to a family dinner at the apartment where she'd grown up. Nina Garcia, leaning on her cane, met them at the door herself. Her first steps after surgery were still difficult, but her face radiated determination and joy. At the table, set with the festive Madonna dinnerware and crystal glasses from the cabinet, they talked about the future, about new factory projects, about the upcoming renovation of the apartment, and Nina's planned trip to a health resort, her first real vacation in many years. "I want to raise a toast," Nina Garcia said, rising with difficulty but firmly. "To knowledge and honesty always being valued more than cunning and deceit." Looking at her mother and at Borge, Barbara thought of the winding road her life had taken. How many obstacles she'd had to overcome, how many doubts to silence, from the hopeless days when it seemed her education and skills were worthless, to now, when she had finally found her place in life. She had no regrets, not about leaving school, nor the years spent with a mop and bucket. Every step of the journey had shaped who she became, had taught her to value the work of every employee, from the janitor to the engineer, to understand that true leadership isn't about a title or an office, but about daily responsibility for the people who trust you. Outside, the summer day faded into golden evening light, flooding the apartment with warmth. A whole life lay ahead, with new trials and new victories. But now Barbara knew she was ready to face them with an open heart and head held high, because she had learned the most important thing, to believe in herself and in the people beside her. Dear friends, how did Barbara's actions make you feel? Do you think it's right to choose the difficult path of honesty over personal comfort? Share your thoughts in the comments. We wish you good health and a wonderful mood.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.